On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in the history of human warfare was underway. 156,000 Allied soldiers were crossing the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. The ships numbered nearly 7,000. The aircraft above them numbered more than 11,000. It had taken years to plan, months to prepare, and the entire strategic future of the Second World War depended on whether the German forces waiting on the other side of that water were where the Allies needed them to be. They were. Just barely. And the reason they were in the right place, the reason the beaches of Normandy were not as heavily defended as they could have been, the reason the invasion succeeded rather than collapsing into the bloodiest military catastrophe of the 20th century, came down in no small part to one man. He was not a soldier. He had never been trained as a spy. He had no military experience, no intelligence background, no formal education in the dark arts of deception. He was a 32-year-old Spaniard who had previously worked, among other things, managing a small chicken farm. He spoke no English. He had never visited Britain. And in the years before D-Day, he had constructed, entirely from his own imagination, a network of 27 completely fictional secret agents who existed nowhere except in the letters and radio transmissions he sent to Nazi Germany. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia. The British gave him the code name Garbo, after Greta Garbo, the greatest actress of the age, because his ability to perform a role was considered without equal in the entire history of Allied intelligence. The Germans gave him the Iron Cross. The British gave him the MBE. He is the only person in the entire Second World War known to have received major decorations from both sides of the conflict. And almost nobody in the world knows his name. This is the complete story of Agent Garbo, the man who built an army that did not exist, fed it to the enemy as real intelligence, and used it to save tens of thousands of lives on a single June morning in 1944. To understand what Juan Pujol Garcia did, you first have to understand the world that made him. He was born in Barcelona in 1912, the son of a fabric manufacturer, into a Spain that was moving toward the catastrophe of civil war. When that war came in 1936, he was 24 years old and he was conscripted, as almost every young Spaniard was, to fight in it. He served on both sides at different points, a consequence of the chaotic and fluid nature of the conflict rather than any ideological flexibility on his part. What the Spanish Civil War produced in Juan Pujol Garcia was not military skill or political conviction. It produced something more durable and more unusual. It produced a profound, bone-deep hatred of totalitarianism in every form. He had watched fascism and communism tear his country apart. He had seen what happened to ordinary people when ideology consumed everything. And he had decided, with a quiet certainty that would define the rest of his life, that if the world was going to have any version of a future worth living in, the forces of Nazism would have to be defeated. When the Second World War began in 1939 and it became clear that Britain was one of the last major powers still standing against Hitler, Pujol made a decision that sounds straightforward in retrospect but was, at the time, genuinely extraordinary. He decided he was going to help the Allies. Not by joining a military unit, not by donating money or spreading propaganda. He was going to become a spy who worked for the British against the Germans from inside Spain, using nothing but his own intelligence and his own imagination. He approached British intelligence in Madrid in 1941 and offered his services. He told them he wanted to work as an agent. He had no particular credentials to offer beyond his willingness and his hatred of fascism. British intelligence, operating through the official channels of their Madrid station, evaluated his offer and turned it down. He was an unknown quantity. He had no network, no connections, no track record. The British said no. Juan Pujol Garcia did not accept no as a final answer. He simply went in a different direction. If the British would not recruit him as a spy, he would become one anyway and prove his value before asking again. And the way he would do that was by approaching the other side first. In 1941, he made contact with a German Abwehr, the Nazi military intelligence service, and presented himself as a committed Nazi sympathizer who wanted to work as a German agent in Britain. He had no particular reason to be believed. He had no pro-Nazi history. He was a Spanish civilian with no obvious access to British military secrets. But he was persuasive, he was fluent in the language of ideological commitment that the Abwehr wanted to hear, and he got himself recruited. The Germans were delighted. They gave him instructions. They told him to travel to Britain, establish himself, recruit subagents, and begin reporting on military activity. They gave him a cover story, some basic training in invisible ink and secret communication, and a contact address in Madrid where he should send his reports. And then Juan Pujol Garcia did something that captures the particular quality of his genius better than anything else in this story. He did not go to Britain. He went to Lisbon, Portugal. He found a guidebook to England. He found a map of the London Underground. He found English-language newspapers and travel magazines and military reference books. He found a copy of the British Railway timetable. And from a rented room in Lisbon, entirely alone, having never set foot in England, he began writing intelligence reports about British military activity and sending them to Berlin. The reports were extraordinary acts of improvisation. He described British troop movements he had invented. He quoted conversations with military officers he had fabricated. He described the geography of cities he had never visited, using guidebooks as his source material, in ways that were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to avoid direct contradiction. When he described Scottish soldiers as men who would do anything for a liter of wine, it was a detail so specific that the Abwehr handlers in Madrid assumed only a real observer could have produced it. He was making it up. Every single word. From a city he had never left for a country he had never entered. He also began, during this Lisbon period, to construct the network of subagents that would become the foundation of everything that followed. He told the Germans he had recruited a handful of reliable sources with access to various parts of British society. He gave them names. He gave them backgrounds. He gave them personalities. A Portuguese man with business connections in England. A Swiss gentleman with contacts in the financial world. A man from Venezuela with access to high society. A waiter based in Gibraltar who could observe naval movements. None of them existed. All of them had files in Pujol's own imagination as detailed and consistent as if they were real people. He managed this network of fictional human beings by keeping meticulous notes. He tracked what each agent was supposed to know, where each agent was supposedly located, what each agent had supposedly reported, and what each agent's relationship with the others was supposed to be. He was, in effect, running a human resources department for a workforce that did not exist, and doing it with sufficient consistency that trained German intelligence professionals examining his reports found no contradictions. For 9 months, he did this alone. Then British intelligence found out. An MI6 officer in Lisbon, who had previously dismissed Pujol's approach, began to notice something strange. German intelligence appeared to have a new source in Britain. Reports were reaching Berlin about British military activity. But the details in those reports did not match what British intelligence knew was actually happening. They were close enough to be plausible, but wrong in ways that suggested the source was not actually in Britain. The investigators pulled the thread. They found Pujol. And when they found him, and when they understood what he had been doing for the past 9 months entirely on his own initiative with no training and no support, they did not just recruit him. They sat him down in front of their most senior officers and tried to understand how it was possible that an untrained Spanish civilian had constructed a network of fictional agents so convincing that the Abwehr had not detected a single inconsistency. He was moved to London in April 1942. He was given the code name Garbo. He was assigned a handler named Thomas Harris, a half-Spanish art dealer who spoke fluent Spanish and who would become one of the most important figures in the intelligence operation that followed. And together, Pujol and Harris began transforming the modest fictional network that Pujol had built in Lisbon into something vastly more ambitious. By the time they were finished, The Garbo network consisted of 27 imaginary agents operating across Britain and beyond, each with a distinct identity, a distinct role, a distinct voice in the communications that went to Berlin, and a distinct set of capabilities that the Germans believed they were drawing on when they evaluated Allied military intentions. The network included a sub-agent who worked as a courier for the Ministry of Information and had access to government publications. Another who was connected to the Venezuelan diplomatic community in London. One based in Scotland who reported on military activity in the north of Britain. One embedded in the British Army itself, supposedly a disgruntled officer with access to operational planning. One in Gibraltar. One in Wales. One in the Merchant Navy. Together they covered the geography of Britain comprehensively enough that the Abwehr believed it had better intelligence on Allied military dispositions than it had from any other source. Every one of them was Juan Pujol Garcia, sitting in a house in North London with Thomas Harris beside him, a typewriter in front of him, and a card index system that tracked the fictional biography of each imaginary person in precise detail. He even killed some of them off when operationally necessary. When a fictional agent had been given information that later turned out to be verifiably wrong, the cleanest solution was to have that agent die of a convenient illness before the Germans could ask too many questions. Pujol would report the death with appropriate solemnity. Fake obituaries were occasionally planted in British newspapers. The Germans sent condolences to the fictitious widows of the fictitious dead agents. On at least one occasion, a widow wrote back, in a letter Pujol composed himself, thanking the Germans for their kind thoughts during her time of grief. The efficiency and psychological coherence of this operation is almost impossible to fully appreciate. Pujol was not just fabricating intelligence. He was managing a long-term deception that required every detail to remain consistent across years of correspondence, that required each fictional character to remain psychologically plausible under continued German scrutiny, and that required the flow of information to be calibrated precisely enough to build German trust without ever providing anything that could cause real harm to the Allies. He transmitted more than 500 radio messages between January 1944 and D-Day alone. 4 transmissions a day, each one representing a fresh exercise in creative deception, routed through Madrid and retransmitted directly to Berlin, contributing to the picture of Allied military activity that the German High Command was using to make strategic decisions. What those messages were building toward was the centerpiece of the entire deception operation, something the Allies called Operation Fortitude. By 1944, the Allied leadership had settled on Normandy as the location for the long-anticipated invasion of Western Europe. The beaches of Normandy offered the best combination of distance from England, beach conditions suitable for a large-scale landing, and access to the European interior that the Allies needed. But Normandy was not where the Germans expected the invasion to come. Hitler and his high command were convinced that the most logical invasion point was Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest stretch of the English Channel, the point where Britain and France are closest together, a place that military logic seemed most clearly to indicate. The Germans were not wrong to think this. Pas-de-Calais was the logical choice, which is exactly why the Allied planners chose Normandy instead, and exactly why they desperately needed the Germans to remain convinced that Pas-de-Calais was the target. If the German armor and infantry that were positioned to defend Calais could be kept there while the real invasion landed at Normandy, the Allied forces would have a window, however brief, to establish a beachhead before those forces could be redeployed. Operation Fortitude was the plan to keep those German forces at Calais, and its most important instrument was Agent Garbo. The operation involved a range of deceptions that went well beyond Pujol's fictional network. Dummy landing craft were positioned in the ports of southeast England, in the part of Britain geographically closest to Calais, to suggest preparations for a cross-channel invasion at the nearest point. An entirely fictitious military formation called the 1st United States Army Group was invented and given every appearance of reality. Fake radio traffic was generated. False signals were sent. And General George Patton, one of the most aggressive and feared commanders in the Allied arsenal, was placed in nominal command of this fictional army because the Germans knew Patton's reputation and assumed that a real invasion would be led by a commander of his capability. Pujol's fictional network was woven into this broader fabric. His agents began reporting the activity they were supposedly observing in southeast England. Troop concentrations, supply buildups, naval preparations, all of it pointing toward a Calais crossing. All of it feeding into the German picture of an invasion that was coming at the place the German High Command had already decided it was most likely to come. The reports were calibrated with extraordinary care. They had to be specific enough to be credible. They had to be consistent with the dummy military preparations the Germans were observing through aerial reconnaissance. They had to build a coherent picture without including anything that would give away the actual Normandy preparations that were simultaneously underway in the west of England and the south of Wales. The Garbo network was not simply lying to Germany. It was constructing an alternative reality that had to hold together under professional scrutiny by experienced intelligence analysts who had every incentive to find holes in it. It held. Month after month, through the whole of the long build-up to the invasion, the German assessment of Allied intentions remained focused on Calais. The panzer divisions that could have been redeployed to reinforce Normandy remained where the German High Command believed they were needed, waiting for an invasion that existed only in the communications of 27 people who had never been born. And then came the moment that secured Garbo's credibility with Germany forever. The moment that made everything that followed possible. The moment that may have been the single most important act of strategic deception in the entire war. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, as Allied forces were already crossing the Channel and the invasion of Normandy was underway, Juan Pujol Garcia sat down at his radio transmitter and sent an urgent message to his German handlers. He reported that his network had learned the invasion was about to begin, that the landing would take place at Normandy, that this was genuine, time-critical intelligence that required immediate action. The message was urgent. It was detailed. It was exactly what a loyal and trusted agent would send if he had genuinely discovered the invasion plan at the last possible moment. And it was sent precisely late enough to be useless. By the time Pujol transmitted his warning, the first Allied soldiers had already been at sea for hours. The invasion was so far advanced that no German response to his warning could have arrived at Normandy in time to change the outcome of the landing. He had timed the message with surgical precision, calculating the exact window in which the information would arrive too late to be actionable, but early enough to be technically accurate. The Germans received the message the following morning. Their radio operators had been asleep during the small hours when Pujol transmitted. When they woke up and read it, they found an urgent warning that had been sitting in their system while the invasion it described was already underway. To anyone examining the record of this exchange, the implication was clear. Garbo had discovered the real invasion plan and had tried to warn Germany. The failure to act on his warning was a German failure, not a failure of his intelligence. He had done his job. The German military had failed to do theirs. His credibility with the Abwehr, already extremely high after 3 years of apparently reliable reporting, was now impregnable. And he used that impregnable credibility immediately. 3 days after D-Day on June 9, 1944, Pujol sent what may have been the most consequential piece of strategic intelligence in the entire war. Drawing on reports from his fictional network of agents across Britain, he sent a detailed assessment to Berlin arguing that the Normandy landing was not the main Allied invasion. It was a diversion, a feint designed to draw German forces away from the real target. The main invasion force, Pujol reported, was still in southeast England. It was still preparing. It was commanded by Patton. And it was still coming. At Calais, this message reached Hitler. Hitler read it. Hitler believed it. And Hitler, in a decision whose consequences shaped the final phase of the war in Western Europe, ordered that the panzer divisions being rushed from Calais to reinforce the Normandy defense be halted. He held them in place. He waited for the second invasion that Garbo had promised was still coming. It never came. The panzers sat at Calais for weeks. By the time the German High Command finally accepted that Normandy was the real invasion and that no second landing was coming at Calais, the Allied beachhead was too firmly established to dislodge. The window for a decisive counterattack had closed. The fate of the German defense of Western Europe had been sealed, in no small measure, by a message from a fictional spy network managed by a Spanish chicken farmer in a house in North London. Historians have estimated that the combination of Operation Fortitude and Garbo's June 9th message kept as many as 22 German divisions pinned at Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that existed only in the reports of a man who did not exist. What that hesitation meant in practical terms is impossible to calculate with precision. But military historians who have studied the question have argued consistently that without it, the Allied beachhead at Normandy would have faced a substantially heavier German counterattack in those critical early days. Whether the invasion would have succeeded without the deception is a question that cannot be answered. What is certain is that thousands of men who landed on those beaches and survived the following days and weeks of fighting did so partly because the German armored reserves that should have been sent to stop them were waiting in the wrong place. In the autumn of 1944, two things happened that bookmarked the extraordinary story of Agent Garbo. First, the Germans awarded Juan Pujol Garcia the Iron Cross. The decoration was presented through his handlers in recognition of what the Abwehr considered his exceptional service to the German war effort. He accepted it. He expressed the appropriate gratitude. And then he went home to the house in North London, where he was simultaneously being processed for the Member of the Order of the British Empire, which King George VI would personally award him in recognition of his service to the Allied cause. He is the only person in the recorded history of the Second World War to hold both decorations simultaneously. After the war, Pujol faced a problem that is peculiar to the world of double agents. He had spent years pretending to be a fanatical Nazi. He had built a relationship of trust and professional respect with senior figures in German military intelligence. Several of those figures had survived the war and were not in custody. Some of them were dangerous. And some of them, if they ever learned the full truth of what Garbo had done, might consider it a matter of honor to find him. In 1949, Juan Pujol Garcia faked his own death. He arranged for records to show he had died of malaria while working in Angola. Obituaries were placed. Official records were updated. The man the Germans had trusted with their most sensitive intelligence assessments, the man who had received their highest decoration, simply ceased to exist on paper. He moved to Venezuela. He settled in the city of Caracas. He opened a small gift shop. He lived a quiet life under a different name, known to almost nobody as anything other than a Spanish immigrant who had come to South America after the war. His wife and children knew parts of the story. His neighbors knew none of it. He was, to the world, nobody. He remained nobody for more than 30 years. In 1984, a British historian named Nigel West was researching a book about the double-cross system, the British program that had managed Pujol and dozens of other double agents during the war. West had heard rumors that Garbo might still be alive. He made inquiries. He followed threads. And eventually, after considerable effort, he found an elderly Spanish man in Caracas who, when approached carefully and given sufficient reason to trust, acknowledged that he was the man the British had once called Garbo. Pujol was 71 years old. He had not spoken publicly about any of this for more than 3 decades. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, Juan Pujol Garcia traveled to Normandy for the first time. He stood on the beaches where the invasion he had helped make possible had landed. He walked the ground where thousands of men had died and thousands more had survived because a wall of German armor that should have been waiting for them was parked at the wrong end of France, waiting for an army that only existed in his imagination. He was interviewed. He wrote an autobiography, published in 1985. He gave talks. He met veterans of the invasion who had no idea, during all the years they had spent remembering what they had survived, that a significant part of the reason they had survived it was a Spanish civilian in a house in London who spent his days typing letters from people who had never been born. Juan Pujol Garcia died in Venezuela in 1988. He was 76 years old. The full extent of his contribution was classified by the British government for decades. The files began to be released to the public in the 1990s, and the picture that emerged from them was if anything, more remarkable than the outline already known. The Garbo network had been so completely trusted by German intelligence that at various points during the war, the Abwehr was relying on Pujol's reports as its primary assessment of Allied military intentions in Britain. The man they trusted most completely was the man deceiving them most completely. There is a particular quality to the story of Juan Pujol Garcia that is different from almost everything else in the history of wartime espionage. Most celebrated spies operated within systems. They were trained by their governments, equipped by their agencies, directed by their handlers. Their courage was real, but it existed within a structure that was designed to support it. Pujol had none of that at the beginning. He walked into German intelligence on his own initiative, recruited himself as a spy for a country he had never visited, built his fictional network from scratch with no training and no support, and ran it for 9 months before any Allied government even knew he existed. He did it because he had looked at the world in 1941 and decided that sitting in Barcelona running a chicken farm while Nazi Germany consumed Europe was not something he was willing to do. The 27 imaginary people he created to fight that decision. The 600 letters and radio messages that gave those people voices and histories and movements and information. The moment at 3 in the morning on June 6th when he sat down and sent a warning that was perfectly calibrated to arrive too late. The message 3 days later that stopped Hitler's panzers in their tracks. Every piece of this was built from the same raw materials that a novelist uses. Language, imagination, character. The ability to make a reader believe in something that is not there. The difference is that the reader was Adolf Hitler. And the stakes were the outcome of the Second World War. The next time you watch a documentary about D-Day and the camera lingers on the beach at Normandy, on the monuments and the graves and the extraordinary courage of the men who crossed that water, remember that what made it possible was not only the soldiers and the ships and the aircraft. It was also a man nobody sent, working alone in a foreign city, writing letters from people who did not exist, for a country he had never visited, because he decided that was what the world needed him to do. Leave a comment below. Tell me who you want to see next. If you enjoy the story of Garbo and the way that one person's imagination can change the course of history, you might want to look back at our Elizabeth Holmes and Belle Gibson videos on this channel, because the art of making people believe in something that is not real is one of the oldest human capabilities, and depending on who uses it and how, it can save the world or destroy a piece of it. Subscribe right now so you never miss the next story. Because history is full of people like Juan Pujol Garcia, and almost none of them have been properly told.